Hey everybody, before we begin this week's episode, I just want to let you know that this was recorded in the middle of December, right after the Jewish community was reeling from a number of anti-Semitic attacks. Those attacks are discussed in this episode. However, since that episode was recorded, a number of other attacks have occurred, and that is why those have not been discussed in this week's episode. We all now have a heightened sense of awareness about the anti-Semitism that exists in this country, and we hope that the information on this episode is informative and educational. Thank you very much and enjoy the show.
The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
With recent tragic events on the minds of Jews all across America and the world, we thought it would be a good time to check in with one of our local representatives.
My name is Daniel Rosenthal. I'm the Assembly member for the 27th Assembly District, which is in Queens.
Daniel and I will spend a good amount of time this week discussing what can be done on a governmental level to quell the rise of anti-Semitism and what you, as an individual, can do about it. But that isn't all we're diving into. We will examine some of the recent decisions in New York State that affect the Jewish world more broadly, including family tax credits, as well as the rise of the BDS movement. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Generally in the show, we stay out of politics. That's going to be very difficult in this particular episode, considering that you are a politician. But I want to focus it on two basic areas. The first area we're going to talk about is the politics of politics, about how things work in the New York State Assembly and in Albany in general. And the second part is we're going to talk about some issues that are related to the Frum community. All right?
Well, politics is an occupational hazard for me, so we'll see how this goes.
So I want to ask you a general question about state politics and local politics, and that is we tend to focus all of our energies on national politics, what's going on in Washington, D.C., what's going on with the president, but how much more do state and local politics affect my day-to-day life as opposed to what goes on in Washington, D.C.?
I've always been fascinated by how closely people follow national politics and then totally ignore local politics, considering city government and state government controls almost every part of your life on a day-to-day basis. You know, when we have constituents come to us, they ask us if we handle X, Y, and Z, and the chances are is yes, the only two things that we don't deal with that really affect someone on their daily life is their Social Security and their Medicare. Other than that, everything that they deal with is either regulated by the state or the city. So it's always interesting to see how people focus so much on the president and Congress, but ignore really what's affecting them day to day.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think we focus more on what's going on in Washington, D.C., even before the current president? It's always been kind of the way.
Right, so things have definitely changed now. I think people are more involved in local politics than they used to because politics in general is consuming so much of our lives with this president. But it's hard to explain. Even the traffic, your potholes on your street, the traffic lights, the street lights, the police, the fire department, all those things are local government, either city, state, I guess for you in Long Island, municipalities, and people just seem to ignore it.
So having said that, because a lot of people are focused on Washington, D.C. and not maybe their state and local, they don't necessarily understand how the divide between Republicans and Democrats work on a state level. So we know, based on, especially now with C-SPAN, we know exactly where everybody in Washington, D.C. stands and the arguments they're making. How does that translate, or does it translate to Albany in New York State?
So New York State is a totally different beast than D.C. Here in New York State, Republicans are an endangered species. For instance, I'm in the New York State Assembly. I am one of 150 members in the state. I believe there are 107 Democrats right now to 43 Republicans. So we have about two-thirds of the legislature in the Assembly itself. There's also a significant majority now in the Senate. So really it is a one-party rule in New York State. The governor is, of course, a Democrat as well. So Republicans really don't have much or any influence in this state. What's concerning to me regarding the Jewish community is that there has been this trend, specifically the Orthodox community, to register as Republicans. In New York State, you can only vote in Democratic primaries if you are a registered Democrat. So a lot of these Orthodox communities, they might vote Republican in general elections, but their assembly members, their state senators, and all the way up are all elected Democrats. And most areas of those Jewish communities aren't even what we call marginal seats. They're not even battleground seats between Republican and Democrats. They're safe Democratic seats. So they, for all purposes, they really have no say in their local government, because really most decisions and most of your local elected officials are decided in the primary.
Right.
That's just the math. That's
right.
the reality
And
of
by
it.
the time the general rolls around, there may not even be a Republican voting against.
Right, frequently.
So, but this hasn't always been the case. I mean, when I was growing up, we had a Republican governor. We had a Republican mayor, followed by Bloomberg for 3 terms, 1 Republican, 2 independent. This isn't always been the case in New York State and New York City. What changed?
I think it's a phenomenon throughout the entire country. We used to have quote-unquote red states where it wouldn't be unusual to find 1 Republican senator and 1 Democratic senator. That is almost extinct at this point. It's not just in New York State. Most states have really, for the most part, moved entirely one way or the other. I'm trying to think of the senators who, like Claire McCaskill in Missouri was a Democrat in a very red state. She's no longer there. And you just go down the list of the only example I could think of a real Democrat or an old school Democrat who still represents a Republican state is Joe Manchin from West Virginia. It's really hard to think of an example these days where you'll have someone from the opposite party represent a state that's mostly not the same party.
Doug Jones.
Right. That was
exception.
That was the unique. He was running against a child molester,
Right.
or accused child molester, and he only won by a few points still.
So you mentioned that a lot of Orthodox Jews register Republican, which takes them out of voting in the primary.
Right.
Now, you represent a district that has a large contingency of Orthodox Jews, and even the ones who register Democrat can tend to vote red in elections where that matters. So you're representing not entirely red-minded people, but a good section of your contingency might think more on the right side of the aisle, be more conservative. And you are a Democratic representative. So how do you balance being on the Democratic side of the aisle while representing a large contingency of conservative voters?
It is always an interesting balancing act in politics. You try to, I'm the most local level of elected official there is. I have 135,000 constituents. That might seem like a lot, but if you compare it to the U.S. Senate or, Congress, which I believe has 700,000, it's really not that much. And we try to focus on issues that are important to every unique part of my district. For instance, we have across the street from my office right here, we have NYCHA, which is essentially government housing, the New York State Housing Authority, which has been in the news for some really terrible things, including having dangerous amounts of lead, mold in apartments, and things like that. That is significantly different than other parts of my district where homes go for $3 million. So we try to work very locally and specifically on every issue. And obviously the Jewish community itself has very unique issues, especially right now in this trying time.
Right, so we're going to get to those. I just have one more question about how it works up in Albany for our listeners. You are a representative in the Assembly, and there's also a Senate. So can you explain the difference between the Assembly and the Senate and what their functions are in New York State?
It's very similar to what we see in D.C., just like you have the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and the President. We have the New York State Assembly, we have the New York State Senate, and then we have the governor. So the New York State Senate, instead of being 150 members, there's only 63 in the entire state. I believe their districts are about 300-something plus thousand people, so their districts are larger. So there's less of them, rather, so their votes carry significantly more weight than mine has. I am one vote of 150. They are one of 63.
All right, and it has to carry both houses in order to get to the governor the same way that would be in the Senate and the House of Representatives in Washington.
Exactly. So I have a bill. I will get sponsored by a senator. I will hopefully pass it through the Assembly, then pass it through the Senate, then hopefully signed by the governor.
All right.
Although I have been victim to the veto before.
The tragic veto. So you mentioned a lot of the issues that the Orthodox world is facing now, and I want to bring them up in terms of how they're being handled in Albany and on the local level. So the first one is a little bit on everybody's mind right now. We're recording a few days after a terrible attack in Jersey City, where there's a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of hate crime, not in Jersey City in particular, but nationally, locally as well. Since those attacks, there's actually been 2 more. There was an attack in a shul in California, in Los Angeles, and there was an attack on 2 college students in the University of Indiana. But we do see a lot of the anti-Semitism locally, and I wanted to get a little bit more of what's being done in Albany to kind of combat not only anti-Semitism, but hate crimes in general.
Yeah, what is going on right now is really It's really terrifying, to be honest. We've done things in Albany, and I could list those off for you, but it almost seems like that'll be in vain because of what's happening. Clearly, we're still unsuccessful at what we've been trying to accomplish. We saw a few years ago, we started to see some SWAT stickers in a playground in Queens. We've seen SWAT stickers in subways. Then we saw some windows were broken in synagogues in Brooklyn. Then we had Jews being attacked in Brooklyn. And now there's a body count in our area. And again, then there's the college student who was beaten up in Indiana, the Persian synagogue, which had the Torah scrolls ripped up in L.A., which was, those photos were all too reminiscent of history. There has been accomplishments in Albany, but clearly it's not enough. Hate crimes in general are up amongst all categories. Of course, the highest number that they're up the most is anti-Semitic hate crimes. There's been increased security funding in the past. There's now a New York State Homeland Security funding, which mimicked a federal program that's been around for a while. That funding increased this year for softer targets in upstate New York. As you know, Jews like to migrate north for the summer, up in the mountains, so a lot of those, there's funding for that.
Not so far north.
Not so far. For us, relatively north. So there have been things done. Is it enough? Clearly it's not. We need to see, real things, real resources allocated. After this past attack in Jersey City, I called the chief of the NYPD here, and I asked him what he was doing. He told me what they're doing, extra deployments, called a HOW order, X, Y, and Z. And I just responded to him. I said, this is starting to seem like protocol already. It wasn't the first time we've had this conversation. We had it after Poway. We had it after the Tree of Life Synagogue. I was like, it's just becoming sad that I call up. He tells me what he's doing. I know what he's going to say. He knows what I'm going to say. And it's scary that this is almost becoming a part of our protocol.
I also tend to see, especially how these things are reported, people use the background of the attacker as kind of a political whipping stick to advance their particular agendas. I just think that in our community, we don't care who's perpetrating the attacks as much as the fact that the attacks are being perpetrated.
The Jewish community knows very well that anti-Semitism crosses all ideological spectrums. It's been around. It's probably the oldest hate that there is. We've seen it from now right-wing supremacists. We've seen it from left-wing supremacists. I think at the end of the day that the Jewish community does not do well when either the radical right or the radical left are in charge. We have seen, at this point, we have seen motives on both sides that are concerning. And I think that's also important, why it's important for the Jewish community to, sometimes you might have your own political opinions, but when it comes to anti-Semitism, it's important to take a step back, take a deep breath, and realize if we are going to be safe in this country for many generations to come, you need to have friends in both sides of the aisle, and you have to make friends with Republicans, you have to make friends with Democrats, you need to educate people, because we've seen this is a very depressing podcast. Very quickly, we have seen anti-Semitism has a long history, and we learn about it in school, and it's important to try to make sure it stays apolitical.
Exactly. So on that note, is there any legislation coming down the pike in the future that we might hear about that might target these things? I noticed that right after the Jersey City attacks, there was an increased police presence in a lot of communities. Is that something that maybe we could have on a more permanent basis? Because generally after an attack, everybody has a heightened sense of awareness. It's when the sense of awareness kind of falls that these attacks tend to happen more often.
Unfortunately, right now that we know that these attacks are not lone incidences, there's no shortage of incidents we can name from the past 2 years. After this happened, I think part of my job is when any injustice or anything wrong that happens, I'm in a position where you have to take a deep breath and you have to think, what is the best answer? I've spoken to a colleague that I'm very close with, as well, to see what can we do to try to make a difference. It would be very easy for me to use this as a political benefit and just stand up and say, I want $500 million in New York State budget for security funding for synagogues and schools, right? I could do that. No one's stopping me. But I know that's not a realistic ask right now. $500 million with a budget deficit of $4 billion this upcoming year. We know that would just be me using a tragedy for a political benefit. So I am talking with a colleague that I'm very close with. We are trying to work on something that we believe is something tangible that we can accomplish. Obviously, you're still allowed to dream and we're still allowed to have high hopes, but we want to make sure that we're not using a tragic death of people for our own political game, and we want to be responsible in whatever we call on. And there are security experts and there are legislative experts who we are consulting with. It's already been a week. It's only been a week since the attack. If those of us who truly did care about making things better want to use this for political gain, I would stand here and, again, do that press conference and ask for a unrealistic amount of money. But we want to be able to do something that's realistic. It might be hard, but that's okay. And that will make our community safer.
And those of us who aren't in government, so that's me in this conversation, but that's the vast majority of the people that are going to be listening to this podcast. What can we do? I know that after the Parkland shooting, a lot of the local community got up and mobilized and really fought for the action that they thought was right in order to fight against future potential attacks. What can we do as a community that might have some sort of a lasting effect?
So I know some folks love the press conference and the rally thing, which I do believe is important because it's important to get your narrative out in the press. Again, but let's make this full circle. Let's talk about the beginning of this conversation about local politics and how that affects our day-to-day life. If schools or sensitive targets, houses of worship get any funding, that's either through the city or that's either through New York State. So to do that, one, it's important for folks, maybe with some of their neighbors, meet with their local assembly member, meet with their state senator, say hello, introduce yourself to them, ask for a meeting, obviously, express some of their concerns, and build that relationship. Educate them. We deal with people from all walks of life, from all sort of advocacy groups. For instance, the issues that we face here in Queens are significantly different than the issues that New Yorkers face in Erie County. This is a very large state, and it's important that not every legislator is an Orthodox Jew. And it's important to educate those who are not as familiar with our community. You can't assume that someone knows our concerns. And our concerns are very real. There's no question about that. And it's important to educate and build that relationship. I think the most important thing about politics is to have a relationship with the people who represent you. You may not like all of them, and it might not be a great relationship, but you need to try. And it's extremely important right now for the Jewish community to not be complacent. We may have been comfortable for a long time. Right now, obviously, we're all a little emotional because we're only a few days out of the shooting, so I don't want to sound too depressing. But we don't have the luxury right now of being complacent with the current of what's going on in the current events.
And this advice goes for not just New York State, obviously. It goes anybody who's listening anywhere. Get in touch with your local representatives.
Right, anywhere. There's a reason that there's local government, local elected officials. We are here to meet with our constituents.
So I want to move off of the local anti-Semitism. I want to move on to some other issues that might be on the minds of the Orthodox world, or even the entire Jewish world. The next thing I want to talk about is Israel. Now, I know that New York State doesn't have a say in international dealings, how the United States deals with Israel as much as they do, let's say, in Washington, D.C. But one thing that we do have here is a whole fight over BDS legislation. So I want to ask, first of all, is there a movement to make BDS currently a state policy? And is there a movement to fight against BDS?
So one, I will reiterate what I said in the previous question, is that to have those relationships, if you look through the New York State congressional delegation, most members of Congress were in either the state assembly or the New York City council beforehand, minus very few exceptions. Most people's first political gig is not being in Congress. If you look through, right here, we're in Congresswoman Grace Meng's district. She was in the New York State Assembly previously. South here was Greg Meeks, who I believe was also in the New York State Assembly. Chuck Schumer was in the New York State Assembly. So it's important to build those relationships early. I know there are Jewish community organizations that do that, like JCRC always brings a delegation of New York State legislators to Israel to inform them about that early on. So building relationships there is also important. Regarding BDS specifically, back in 2016, Governor Cuomo signed the country's first executive order to combat BDS that would pretty much ban any state agency from doing business in any way that would help strengthen the BDS movement. So we really, truly commend Governor Andrew Cuomo, who's been very good with Israel and has been there several times as governor on that. And he was the first in the nation in that sense. It's obviously important to combat BDS in any way possible. BDS is anti-Semitic. If people focus on one country in the Middle East obsessively to boycott, in a region that is full of some terrible human rights conditions, and the country that they obsess over is Israel, the one real democracy there, the one country with rights there, is just insane. There's no other way around it.
So let me ask you this: are there movements to make BDS completely illegal in the state?
There is legislation that some Senate that is in the New York State Assembly to further combat BDS. I obviously strongly oppose BDS in the harshest terms possible. There is obviously, when you get into this legislation, there are serious concerns when it does come to First Amendment rights, and that is a difficult balance. It's always important to get folks on the record, especially when they're running for office. If there's a candidates forum near you, you should go and get them on the record. Say, do you believe BDS is anti-Semitic? Do you promise to not support BDS? That's obviously crucial to make sure that you have elected officials on the record, especially when it's always not as politically convenient as it used to be. It used to be an assumed answer in politics that someone was against BDS. That is no longer the case. It is a movement that has seemed to gain traction here recently, unsuccessfully. I mean, BDS has been really a failure throughout the world in the most part. Most of their boycotts have been unsuccessful. Maybe there's a few exceptions. And just to remember a few years ago when I think it was Matisyahu tried to play in a European country and they banned him.
Was it France?
Right. It was one of the. I'm not sure it was France. It was one of those countries, and they banned him for BDS. He's not even Israeli. He's Jewish.
Right.
So I think it was more proof of that, of how anti-Semitic BDS is. And also, it's important to remind everyone that BDS isn't against the 67 settlements, occupation, whatever terms you want to use. BDS does not recognize the right for the state of Israel to exist, period.
I think I just saw that they're anti-Sabra hummus also, which is owned by Pepsi.
Yeah, right.
At this stage. So it's just become a little bit more of a catch-all. But I do appreciate that there is a free speech aspect of this. And I understand that as a governor, you can say we're not going to associate ourselves with anybody that supports the BDS movement, which is fine. But then once you get to the point of making it illegal to have a BDS movement in general, then that you're already focusing on things that might affect free speech. And that is obviously a slippery slope. We don't want that to affect other things that we like to do just because somebody else doesn't like what we're saying.
Right. So an executive order specific is not a legislation. Executive order is the governor ordering state authorities to do something, which as the governor, he has the authority over.
Right.
I do want to add that New York City Council did pass a resolution condemning BDS several years ago. I will just point that out as well.
Last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of what's going on in Albany are kind of the 529 savings plans, a lot of the tax credits for tuitions. And I see you're smiling a little bit, but I want to know how things work out in New York State versus other states for helping out with tuition assistance for families.
I mean, tuition is probably the biggest financial difficulty that the Jewish community has, paying $20,000 a year plus for several children. I'm not there yet, so I don't exactly share in your pain right
that
now.
Hurts so much.
It was just a few years ago where the educational tax credits were a realistic thing. Someone stopped me in the grocery store, Erev Shabbos, a few weeks ago and asked me what was happening with those. Right now, I wish I could say that there's been positive movement on it. There hasn't been. The OU with Teach NYS has done a great job at increasing funding every year for reimbursements for STEM education. Local schools right here in Queens have gotten some real reimbursement for that. So there is some success on that. That's been the most successful thing. And there also are some mandated services that are reimbursable, but we are a long way from the days of tax credits are not very realistic these days.
Yeah, we actually spoke with Rabbi Yitz Frank, who works for the Aguda, and he was talking about his successes in Ohio, advocating for these tax credits. They were actually more successful there than are here. Very different states, Ohio, New York, but it is something that we would like to shoot for, and we put our future in your hands, especially those of us with young kids. No pressure.
Yeah, but I will tell you something that I do think is right now, which could be helpful. We've seen New Jersey increase security funding for non-public schools. A lot of folks don't believe that non-public schools should be reimbursed for getting funding for being a religious institution, even though you're just reimbursing for secular studies. But what I do believe that everyone should be able to agree on, what you think would be common sense, was that every child deserves to go to school in a safe environment.
Absolutely.
So we would like to see I know one thing that I'm hoping for legislative session is to push for increased security funding. And we know now, just back to the Jersey City, that the store was not the original target. We know that the Satmar school next door was the original target, and they couldn't get in as of now, which I guess the news is changing by the moment still. But
whatever it was, they didn't get in.
Right. Thank God they did not get in.
Yes. I want to talk to you about one more thing that doesn't have to do with politics in Albany or anywhere, actually. I'm sitting now in your office in Fresh Meadows. So I used to live around here. I actually used to live upstairs from this office. When I was here, it was occupied by Assemblyman Michael Simanowicz, who tragically passed away a number of years ago, and I think you took over for him. If you want to talk a little bit about the legacy that Michael left and the shoes that you had to fill.
As people like to joke around, it was big shoes to fill, literally and figuratively. Mike was a true public servant to the definition. He was someone who was constantly working, constantly asking how he could be helpful. If you ever asked him if he needed help, he would just shoot you down and laugh. Not really laugh, more of an eye roll. It was a tragic loss that no family, no one should have to live through. His loss is still felt by the community. He was someone that I feel privileged and honored to have gotten to know over several years. He used to call me on his way down from Albany, and we used to gossip. I missed those phone calls tremendously. And he was someone who we still get brought up all the time, and that's because he did a lot of good work, and this could really be a thankless job sometimes. And he didn't affect him, and he constantly was trying to help the neighborhood, to help the community he lived in. He would always ask you, do you need anything? Do you need anything? Everything okay? Frequently. Again, just don't ask him if he needed anything. He'll just give you the eye roll.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't spoken about today?
Something that we know is that hate is not something that you're born with. It's something that's taught. So right now what we're doing is that we've partnered with the Simon Wiesenthal Center to allocate funding for them to create a mobile van to go around the city and educate students at a young age about hate, about racism, about antisemitism, to just really try to nip this in the butt, so to say, as early and as young as possible. And we're not going to claim that we can cure the age-old hate, or rather the timeless hate of anti-Semitism, but we're trying to curb it. We know people and children are not born with this.
That sounds like a tremendous educational opportunity. So with that, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us, and look to hear great things from you in the future.
It was my pleasure.
My thanks to Assemblyman Daniel Rosenthal for joining me this week. If you would like to hear an episode that handles these issues from an activist level, you could check out episode 13 of this podcast entitled Lobbying for You. I want to reiterate the importance of reaching out to your local representative. If you live in New York State, you have a state assembly person and a state senator. Other states have different houses, but I'm willing to bet that most people don't even know the names of their own representatives. If we really want to make a difference in our communities, we have to let our voices be heard. You don't have to agree with all of your representatives' policies in order for them to listen to your concerns. Please reach out to your local politicians and help fight for the safety of all of our communities. And please, be careful out there. And of course, Cult of.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Swirly Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queens Jewish Link.